Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and, honestly, pretty provocative source. We're going to neutrally unpack the author's argument about how intimate, private behaviors somehow morphed into public political battlegrounds. We'll be walking step by step through the author's extensive analysis to understand exactly how they view this massive cultural shift. Okay, let's dive right in.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to navigate the author's framework across 6 parts. First, the shift from bedroom to courtroom. 2, the genesis of sexual politics. 3, deconstructing the family unit. 4, overt versus covert power. 5, ideology versus due process. And finally, the age of sexual chaos.
Part 1. The bedroom to courtroom. The drift begins.
So the source kicks things off by describing what it calls the drift. Basically, this is a profound societal shift away from objective truths and towards subjective desires. It's like a complete cultural rewiring, taking something deeply private and making it inherently public. The author maps this out in 3 very distinct steps. It started with a simple plea for privacy, right? Hey, don't judge me in my bedroom. But according to the text, that gradually morphed into a cultural demand. Actually, you need to support what I do. And finally, it arrived at the legal enforcement stage we see today. I will literally take you to court if you don't support it.
Moving on to Part 2, Genesis of Sexual Politics, the Genealogy. To figure out how this drift actually happened, the text traces the genealogy of these ideas straight back to second-wave feminism in the mid-20th century. Specifically, we're looking at the pivotal work of activist Kate Millett. Back in 1970, she introduced this concept called sexual politics. Now, the key takeaway here is her assertion that personal relationships, sexual behavior, and gender roles aren't just private matters at all. Instead, they are inherently political structures designed to maintain power. In the source's view, this completely flipped the traditional notion of private life on its head, framing it fundamentally as a system of oppression.
And to show just how literal this political battle was, the author points us to a 1969 consciousness-raising gathering that Millett actually led. Listen to this. When asked how to create a cultural revolution, the attendees responded explicitly by destroying the family, destroying the American patriarch, and destroying monogamy. The framework suggests these weren't just abstract theories. These were explicit, radical goals discussed by activists to fundamentally deconstruct Western society from the inside out.
Which brings us to this famous maxim that brilliantly captures Millett's whole philosophy. The personal is political. The text argues this cemented her belief that your individual experiences, what happens in your home, in your relationships, are intrinsically tied to giant systemic structures of political power. By making the personal political, the private sphere was essentially erased.
All right, Part 3. Deconstructing the family unit, the ideological target.
Building on that erased private sphere, the source makes the case that the nuclear family didn't just accidentally change over time, it was a deliberate target. The text argues that early feminists viewed the family and motherhood not as the foundational pillars of civilization, but as oppressive systems that desperately needed taking down. As Millett says right here, the family is patriarchy's chief institution. It was seen as this microcosm of systemic oppression that just had to be broken apart to achieve true liberation.
The author then maps out how several prominent figures fueled this exact narrative. You've got Betty Friedan framing homemaking as a housewife trap, where women suffer a slow death of mind and spirit. Gloria Steinem pushing to blur gender lines by raising sons more like daughters. Millett, as we saw, wanting to dismantle the patriarchal unit entirely. And Margaret Sanger, even arguing that women shouldn't be authorized to stay home at all. The text contends that these thinkers propagated a victim narrative that actively devalued traditional maternal roles and ultimately bred a multi-generational confusion for both men and women.
Which leads us to Part 4, Overt versus Covert Power, the Feminine Era.
So, how exactly were these radical changes put into practice? Well, the source categorizes this ideological subversion under a framework it calls the feminine era. It's basically a fundamental shift in how power is wielded and understood in modern society. Think about it this way. Historically, masculine era or masculine power was overt, forceful, and physical. Picture tyrants and warfare. But this new sexual politics, the author argues it relies heavily on covert, subtle power. It uses relational and reputational subversion to rewrite society's norms, often doing so right under the guise of compassion.
Now we arrive at Part 5, Ideology versus Due Process, the Shipwreck.
This brings us to what the author calls the shipwreck, the tangible, real-world fallout. The argument here is that feminist demands for equality have been highly selective. The text points out numerous areas where men face major, unaddressed societal disadvantages. We're talking vast disparities in family court, higher school dropout rates for boys, a total lack of support for male homelessness, and of course the fact that only men are required to register for the military draft. The source essentially asserts that equality is rarely championed when it involves danger, failure, or heavy physical labor.
To put some numbers to that claim, take a look at this. Mothers are granted primary custody in roughly 80% of U.S. divorce cases. The author uses this striking statistic to argue that, despite all the calls for equality, the system heavily favors women in family court disputes, placing a completely unequal systemic burden on fathers.
And we see a similar dynamic in the workforce. This highlights the author's claim that men absolutely dominate the most physically demanding, dangerous jobs, things like logging and construction. As a result, men suffer over 90% of workplace fatalities. Yet, as the text points out, there's virtually no equity advocacy or feminist demand to equalize representation in these lethal lines of work.
But the author argues this shipwreck really culminates in our justice system. The text warns that this ideological environment has created a very dangerous social default. When ideological slogans like "believe all women" take over, they completely erode impartial justice. It creates a system where guilt is simply assumed based on gender alone, completely bypassing due process.
To really drive this point home, the text points to the highly publicized Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial. The source presents this as the ultimate example of the court of public opinion destroying a man's reputation long before any actual due process happens. Remember, Depp faced immediate public condemnation and lost massive lucrative film roles just based on accusations alone. It was only much later, during the trial, when audio evidence of covert manipulation by Heard was revealed, that the narrative finally shifted and the false claims were exposed.
But here's the crucial catch the author emphasizes. It's estimated Johnny Depp had to spend a staggering $5 million in legal fees just to clear his name. That is a massive sum. The text makes the sobering point that fighting an ideological assumption takes immense resources. And realistically, the average man falsely accused simply lacks $5 million. More often than not, he's left to lose his reputation, his custody, and his career without even having the means to fight back.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 6, The Age of Sexual Chaos, the Modern Fallout.
Looking at the wreckage left behind by decades of this ideological subversion, the source describes our present day as an era of sexual chaos. It defines this as a cultural moment marked by deep instability. Traditional family structures and natural biological desires are actively opposed by a destructive, do-as-thou-wilt philosophy. And according to the author, this ultimately leads to society worshiping the self above any kind of communal or familial duty.
And if you want to see the successful implementation of Kate Millett's original radical goals to destroy the patriarchy, the text points straight to this very concerning number, 54%. Over half of children are now raised without a father in the home. The source draws a direct line from the multi-generational lambasting of men and the dismantling of the traditional family unit straight to this massive fatherless statistic.
So, what is the proposed path forward? Well, the text wraps up by giving the reader a three-part call to action. First, recognize the ideological subversion of facts that has taken place. Second, actively resist the dangerous exaltation of narrative and identity-based feelings over hard, actual evidence. And third, work to restore the anchored truths of the traditional family and truly blind, impartial justice.
We're going to leave you today with this final, genuinely provocative question raised directly by the author. What happens to a society and its young men when they are raised entirely without fathers to model what it means to be a man? The text really challenges us to stop and consider the true long-term cost of this sexual chaos on the next generation. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer as we explore the arguments of the source today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.